It begins quietly. No thunderclap of drama, no shouts in the night. Just the low murmur of an estate auction, held on a grey afternoon in a town most of the world has never heard of. The house itself, a weathered Victorian frame with sagging shutters and ivy gripping its walls, had belonged to a family now dissolved by time. Inside, dust clung to every surface. Furniture leaned under the weight of years, and the air smelled faintly of mothballs, mildew, and old paper. To the auctioneers, this was routine, another sale of objects from lives that had faded away. To those in attendance, it was an opportunity: antique glassware, a faded quilt, maybe even a piece of jewelry that could be cleaned and resold. In the middle of the clutter stood a box of books. Most were unremarkable: outdated encyclopedias, children's primers, a family Bible with loose binding. But wedged near the bottom was a leather-bound volume, heavier than the rest. Its cover was cracked, its spine nearly split. When one of the estate workers pulled it free, a puff of dust rose into the air. He set it aside without a second thought. It was, after all, only a diary, or so it appeared. The book was purchased for a few dollars by a schoolteacher with an eye for curiosities. He imagined it would provide little more than personal musings of a long-dead resident. Perhaps notes on crop yields, family squabbles, or musings on the weather. Yet when he opened it later that night, seated in his modest living room with a single lamp illuminating the pages, he felt his breath catch. The handwriting, though neat and legible, was dated in a way that jarred him immediately. The earliest entry bore the year 1962. Nothing unusual. But the entries that followed leapt forward: 1975, 1986, 1993. The teacher frowned, flipping through with growing disbelief. The handwriting was identical across each decade, steady and unchanging, as if the same hand had written them all in a single sitting. But what froze him was not the continuity of script. It was the events described. There, in looping ink strokes, was a passage that spoke of a shuttle exploding in the sky, scattering fire and debris before horrified onlookers. Another passage described crowds tearing down a wall in Germany, cheering as history itself seemed to shift. The teacher's hand trembled. He knew these events. He had seen them on television. They were not imaginings, they were records. Yet the diary claimed to have been written before any of them occurred. He closed the book abruptly, heart pounding. The living room suddenly felt colder, as though some unseen draft had slipped in through the cracks of his house. He told himself it must be a trick. Perhaps someone had forged later entries into an older book. That would explain the uncanny foresight. And yet, the ink, though faded in places, bore no obvious signs of alteration. The pages, browned with age, were consistent throughout. There was no change in tone, no rupture of authenticity. If this was a forgery, it was flawless. The teacher sat there for hours, turning page after page. Some entries were vague, describing shifts in politics, technology, and weather. Others were startlingly precise. He found mention of a flood that tore through Main Street in 1978, a flood he remembered vividly, for he had stood in knee-deep water helping neighbors move their belongings. How could this diary, tucked into an estate box, describe an event that had not yet occurred when the earliest entries were penned? By midnight, the teacher could no longer deny the chill coiling in his stomach. He set the diary aside, but it lingered in the corner of his vision like a presence that refused to be ignored. He thought of burning it, of casting it into the trash before morning. But some stubborn curiosity, some teacher's instinct to preserve knowledge, no matter how unsettling, stayed his hand. He slid it into a desk drawer instead, locking it away as though that might mute its power. The next day, he told no one. How could he? To admit he had found a book that seemed to record the future would invite ridicule at best, suspicion at worst. He decided to keep reading slowly, making notes on a separate pad of paper, comparing each event described with what he knew of history. The deeper he went, the more impossible it seemed to explain away. And yet he dared not share it. But secrets, especially in small towns, rarely stay hidden for long. A visiting neighbor glimpsed the diary on his desk one afternoon and asked about it. The teacher brushed it off, calling it an old journal. But already, a seed had been planted. Within weeks, whispers began to circle, that he had found something unusual in the estate sale, something not meant for ordinary eyes. At the center of it all lay the diary itself, silent, waiting. Its cracked leather cover betrayed nothing of the turmoil it was beginning to cause. To hold it was to feel the weight of decades, both those already past and those not yet lived. Each entry, carefully written, stood like a marker between what was known and what was yet to come. And so the story begins not with fire or blood, but with ink on paper, with words that should not have existed when they were written. A discovery made by chance, in a forgotten house, by a man who could never have predicted the burden he had just inherited. For in those pages, time itself seemed to bend, refusing to obey the ordinary laws that governed the rest of the world. The diary had been found. But its mystery was only beginning. The town itself is easy to overlook on a map. Nestled in the rolling hills of Massachusetts, it appears at first glance to be a place preserved in sepia tones, a snapshot of a bygone era where clapboard houses line narrow streets, and church steeples rise like sentinels over lawns long overgrown. In the mid-20th century, however, the town was not the quaint picture postcard it might appear today. Its streets carried the echoes of industry long gone, of mills and factories that had once drawn hundreds of families to settle along the riverbanks. By the 1960s, most of the young had left for cities promising opportunity, leaving behind a patchwork of aging homes, shuttered storefronts, and a population stubbornly clinging to the remnants of its own past. Walking through the town is like moving through a memory half remembered, half forgotten. The cobblestones are uneven, worn by decades of footsteps. Fences sag beneath the weight of neglect, and the air is tinged with the musty smell of damp earth and old wood. Even the trees seem cautious, their branches bending over streets as though listening to the stories whispered between walls. And yet, in this quiet, there is life, a life that persists in the shadows. Dogs bark behind fences, children's laughter echoes faintly from playgrounds, and the occasional car hums along empty roads, a single engine cutting through the silence. It is a town that looks ordinary, but ordinary is never what the diary had in mind. The families who remained are a mix of stubbornness and sorrow. Some have roots stretching back generations, their histories tangled with the town itself. Others are newcomers, drawn by the stillness and the cheap houses abandoned by those who moved on. The diaries of this town, family journals, school records, letters, paint a picture of continuity and ritual. Birthdays, funerals, harvests, and anniversaries are marked with equal care. But hidden beneath these mundane patterns are the shadows that the diary would soon illuminate, grudges kept alive across decades, secrets buried in basements and attics, and a sense that something within the town refuses to be understood fully. It is in this environment, unremarkable yet quietly oppressive, that the diary surfaces. To any casual observer, it is just another artifact among many, destined to be catalogued and forgotten. But the town has its own peculiar rhythms, its own way of absorbing mysteries until they take root. Here, superstition and folklore are never far from the surface. The older generation remembers stories of strange lights over the river, of vanished children in the woods, of inexplicable noises that drift through the streets on still nights. The young dismiss these stories, often with scorn, but they linger in the background, shaping how residents perceive events that cannot be explained. It is within this subtle tension between disbelief and lingering fear that the diary begins to exert its influence. The physical layout of the town also seems to conspire with its mysteries. Narrow alleys wind unpredictably between buildings, often opening onto hidden courtyards or abandoned lots. A single street can twist and turn so that one can walk in a straight line and still feel as if the town is folding in on itself. At dusk, shadows stretch unnaturally along walls, creating shapes that hint at movement even when no one is there. Fog frequently rises from the river in early mornings, coating the streets in a spectral haze that transforms ordinary corners into portals of unease. In this way, the town itself becomes a character, silent, watchful, and perhaps complicit in the diary's uncanny revelations. By the time the diary had surfaced in the auction, the town was already steeped in quiet apprehension. Residents who had spent decades here sensed a subtle shift, though they could not articulate it. People who had ignored small rumors of missing objects, unexplained footsteps, and unaccounted for noises now felt them more acutely. Even the landscape seemed to respond, as if the wind carried a different weight, and the trees bent a little closer to listen. The diary did not simply exist in isolation, it was intertwined with the town's collective consciousness, amplifying what had long been ignored and transforming normalcy into something fragile, something uneasy. Small businesses began to notice strange occurrences coinciding with the diary's presence. The grocer reported inventory misplaced in ways that made no sense, the post office received letters that seemed to arrive before they were sent. Nothing overtly frightening, yet the accumulation of anomalies created a pervasive feeling of being watched. And though the townsfolk rarely connected these moments directly to the diary, the threads of unease were already beginning to weave a tapestry of tension that would shape the decades to come. It is important to note that, despite these peculiarities, life in the town continues. Children still play in the streets, farmers tend their fields, and neighbors greet one another with cautious warmth. The diary's emergence does not immediately upend daily routines, but it introduces a persistent undertone, a suggestion that reality, as the town had known it, may be far less stable than they believed. In this town of ordinary facades, the extraordinary waits quietly, and shadows linger not because of what is present, but because of what might arrive, inevitably, on the pages of a single leather-bound book. The diary had arrived, unremarkable to the untrained eye. But within the context of this town, steeped in history, memory, and quiet unease, it would soon become a catalyst. A catalyst not just for knowledge of the future, but for a subtle unraveling of the town's sense of safety, certainty, and understanding. In the shadows of the town, the first stirrings of dread were barely perceptible, but they were there, waiting to grow. The diary did not reveal its full weight immediately. At first, the teacher treated it like any old journal, turning pages out of polite curiosity rather than expectation of revelation. Yet the deeper he read, the more he realized that this was not a record of ordinary life. Each entry was precise, methodical, and impossible in ways that unsettled him gradually, like water slowly filling a sealed vessel. It began with small observations, local elections, town events, and the weather. Simple enough. Yet even these carried details that were incongruous with the diary's apparent date. Certain events were described with the certainty of hindsight, despite supposedly being written decades earlier. By the second night, the teacher had read through entries that seemed to stretch 20 years into the future. At first, he assumed coincidence, or perhaps an educated guess that had happened to align with reality. But then he encountered the first description that defied explanation entirely. A passage detailed a fire that consumed a neighboring town's factory in precise detail, the time, the sequence of explosions, even the specific pattern of smoke as it rose into the sky. He remembered the headlines years later, reading them with a chilling sense of déjà vu. How could a diary written in the early 1960s describe such a tragedy decades before it occurred? The entries became progressively more unnerving. One described a flood in vivid detail, noting which streets would be submerged, which buildings would collapse, and even the frantic movements of residents trying to save their belongings. When he checked town records, every element of the description aligned perfectly with what had happened years later. The teacher's logical mind reeled. Could it be a record written retrospectively? Perhaps, but then why would the diary claim dates decades in advance? Each contradiction compounded the sense of impossibility, making the diary not merely a curiosity, but a source of disquiet. As he continued, the passages expanded beyond local events. The diary chronicled disasters and political developments far beyond the town, the Challenger shuttle disaster, the fall of the Berlin Wall, even cultural phenomena that would shape the decades. Each description was detailed and precise, yet presented as though the author were witnessing events in real time. The teacher felt the weight of it pressing down on him. To read it was to inhabit two realities simultaneously, one in which time moved normally, and another where the future could be observed, recorded, and perhaps anticipated. Sleep became difficult. The teacher began reading late into the night, compelled by a mixture of fascination and terror. He would sit in the dim lamplight, hand hovering over pages, feeling as though he could hear the diary breathing in the silence of the room. Occasionally, he caught himself imagining the figures he had read about, townsfolk whose names appeared in later entries, as though they were walking unseen through his living room. Each entry was a thread, weaving him ever tighter into a tapestry that was larger, darker, and more intricate than any human mind should be able to conceive. He began copying the diary's passages into notebooks, cataloging events, dates, and names. Some he could verify, others he could not. The verification process itself became addictive. Whenever a predicted event came to pass, the sensation was simultaneously thrilling and terrifying. Each confirmation strengthened the diary's authority, making it impossible to dismiss entirely. But with each verified detail came unease. If the diary was right about one thing, what else might it reveal? What disasters or tragedies were already written, waiting silently to unfold? The teacher was not the only one affected. As word of the diary's discovery spread quietly among trusted colleagues and friends, others began to glimpse the same unnerving patterns. A librarian, intrigued by the diary's dates, compared entries to historical records and found startling accuracy. A local historian examined the handwriting, ink, and paper, confirming the apparent age of the diary while admitting that the future predicting passages were inexplicable. These small circles of observers shared a mixture of skepticism and wonder, forming an informal network of those willing to consider the unthinkable. Yet, not all reactions were of curiosity. Fear grew as the implications became clear. To read the diary was to confront the certainty of what was to come, a confrontation that few could endure without anxiety. Some refused to look beyond the first few pages. Others, consumed by morbid curiosity, read obsessively, unable to stop even as the knowledge weighed heavily on their minds. One observer reportedly left the room in tears after encountering a description of a personal tragedy in precise detail, one that would not affect them for decades, yet was recounted as fact in the diary. Even as the teacher continued to study the diary, he became aware of a strange psychological phenomenon. The more he read, the more he anticipated events in the present. Ordinary moments, the ringing of a doorbell, the sudden appearance of a neighbor, were interpreted through the lens of foreknowledge. Time itself seemed elastic. The diary's pages, once simply a record of future events, began to exert influence over perception, reshaping how readers understood the world around them. It was as though the book contained not merely words, but a subtle power that extended into the lives of those who engaged with it. By the end of the first month of readings, the diary had transformed from an object of idle curiosity into a force that dictated behavior, thought, and emotional state. The teacher, initially skeptical and measured, found himself drawn ever deeper, compelled by a mixture of fear, fascination, and responsibility. Each entry, each page, was a puzzle demanding attention, a warning written across decades, and a mirror reflecting the fragility of human understanding when confronted with the impossible. The first readings, innocuous at the outset, had revealed a fundamental truth: this diary was no ordinary artifact. It did not simply recount the past or record memories. It anticipated, it predicted, it unsettled. And in the quiet of that living room, illuminated by a single lamp and filled with the scent of old paper and ink, the teacher realized that he, and perhaps the town itself, had crossed a threshold. From that moment onward, nothing would ever feel entirely safe, entirely predictable, or entirely known. By the late 1960s, the diary's influence had begun to radiate beyond the teacher's quiet study. Small hints of its existence slipped into the town's consciousness like ripples across still water, subtle and almost imperceptible at first. It began with whispers. A librarian mentioned to a colleague, almost in passing, that a strange book had appeared in the town, one that seemed to know more than it should, predicting events that had not yet occurred. The words traveled slowly at first, shared only among trusted friends, often in tones that bordered on disbelief or fear. Even so, once the first mention passed, it was impossible to retract entirely. Townsfolk began to speak in cautious voices about something unusual circulating among a select few. A quiet hysteria began to bloom in corners of the town that were normally undisturbed. Farmers who had lived here their entire lives started to recount tales they had long considered trivial or meaningless. One old mill worker remembered a faint rumor from decades ago, a child who disappeared for a day, only to return with strange knowledge of events not yet seen. Another spoke of unusual lights over the river, witnessed briefly and dismissed at the time. As the diary's presence became known, even indirectly, these recollections were re-examined through a lens of suspicion and dread. Ordinary stories, once benign, took on an unnerving weight. The town's collective memory, always a repository of hidden truths and half-forgotten fears, seemed suddenly more vivid, more charged, as if the diary had awakened dormant anxieties that had long simmered beneath the surface. The whispers soon found witnesses. Individuals who had read the diary in private began to describe what they had seen to one another, initially in hushed tones, fearing mockery or judgment. A neighbor reported that the teacher's eyes appeared hollow, haunted, after nights spent in the lamplight with the diary. A local shopkeeper recounted that the teacher would sometimes pause mid-conversation, as if listening to an invisible voice only he could hear. These testimonies, though anecdotal, reinforced a growing sense of unease. The diary was not merely a collection of words, it was a presence that left an imprint on those who interacted with it. Some began to question their own perceptions. When a townsperson glanced at a newspaper, they would unconsciously compare the printed headlines with the events recorded in the diary. Small coincidences sparked anxiety, a minor fire in a distant town, a sudden illness in a neighbor's household, even the appearance of a rare bird along the riverbank, each instance seemed to echo the diary's pages. What had once been mundane began to feel charged, as though every action, every occurrence, was being subtly monitored, foretold, or anticipated. And yet, there were those who refused to see. Skepticism remained strong among a significant portion of the town's population. Many dismissed the whispers as rumor, or worse, superstition. "It's just a book," they would say. "Someone is playing a prank. People see patterns where none exist." These voices of reason, however, could not fully quiet the growing hum of unease. Even the staunchest skeptics noticed moments of coincidence that defied easy explanation, and the diary's reputation persisted, growing in both size and terror with each retelling. Fear and fascination intertwined in a delicate balance. Residents who encountered the teacher, or glimpsed the diary themselves, often felt a sense of obligation to observe, to verify, and yet simultaneously feared the consequences. It was as though the act of witnessing alone could invite misfortune, or at the very least, disrupt the fragile equilibrium of their lives. Some town elders began to caution their families not to speak of the book. They warned children to avoid curiosity that might seem innocent but could, in their minds, awaken forces beyond understanding. The diary was becoming, slowly and subtly, a moral test as well as a mystery. The teacher, aware that his private investigation was no longer entirely private, grew cautious. Meetings with trusted observers were held in hushed voices, often in dimly lit rooms or quiet cafes far from prying eyes. The diary's readers formed a tenuous network, united by curiosity but divided by fear. Some wished to confront its predictions, others to ignore them entirely. Even among this small group, divisions arose, disagreements over the meaning of specific entries, arguments about whether events described were literal or symbolic, and debates over whether the diary was a warning or simply a record of inevitabilities. At the same time, subtle changes were observed in the town itself. Conversations became quieter when the subject of the diary arose. Eyes lingered on strangers longer than usual. Residents felt as if they were being watched, not by any single person, but by an unseen awareness that extended through the streets, the buildings, and even the air itself. Ordinary gestures, a knock on the door, the sudden whistle of the wind through a chimney, were imbued with suspicion, as though every detail of the environment could contain a clue, a warning, or confirmation of the diary's predictions. The diary's effect on the town was not overt, it did not manifest in catastrophic events or public hysteria. Rather, it was the accumulation of subtle disturbances that created a pervasive sense of anticipation and unease. Witnesses, whether directly engaged with the diary or merely touched by its rumors, became part of a collective consciousness in which the boundaries between present and future, real and imagined, began to blur. In their caution, their whispers, and their careful observation, the townsfolk unwittingly perpetuated the diary's power. By the end of this period, the diary had transcended its physical form. It was no longer merely a book of pages and ink. It had become an agent of attention, a silent observer, and a catalyst for both fear and revelation. In the streets, in the homes, and in the minds of those who had glimpsed its truths, the diary's presence lingered like a shadow, reshaping reality through anticipation, memory, and the collective weight of whispered acknowledgement. The first witnesses, quiet and cautious, had begun to leave traces of themselves in the narrative of the town. And in doing so, the diary's power grew, not through violence or overt action, but through the subtle accumulation of attention, fear, and the inescapable human compulsion to know what should not yet be known. It was here, among whispers and witnesses, that the diary truly began to take hold, embedding itself into the town's consciousness, ensuring that no one who encountered it would ever view their world in the same way again. As the diary's reputation grew quietly within the town, attempts to seek understanding beyond its borders were met with unexpected resistance. The teacher, now aware that the book contained details far beyond local events, reached out to scholars and historians, hoping for guidance or at least an impartial assessment. He wrote letters to universities, to professors of history, and to experts in the study of manuscripts and cultural artifacts. Some responded politely, acknowledging receipt of his inquiries, but most dismissed his claims outright. One historian, a senior academic in Boston, replied that the concept of a diary predicting the future was preposterous and unworthy of serious consideration. To the teacher, this response, though polite, was a door closed firmly in his face. Even when he sought assistance from the local press, he encountered subtle discouragement. A journalist from a regional newspaper listened to his story over coffee, nodding politely as he described the diary and its impossible entries. Yet, when asked if he would write an article, the journalist demurred. He claimed editorial concerns, suggested that the town would not welcome attention, and hinted that pursuing the story could be unwise. There was no explicit threat, no dramatic confrontation, only an almost imperceptible pressure to leave the diary, and its revelations, alone. The teacher left the meeting unsettled, wondering why authorities and intellectual institutions alike seemed intent on discouraging inquiry rather than encouraging it. Religious authority, too, asserted itself with a quiet, pervasive weight. The town's priest, an aging man with decades of familiarity with both parishioners and their secrets, warned families to steer clear of the diary. He claimed that to engage with it was to court spiritual danger. Books like this, he said in hushed tones during sermons, invite forces we do not understand. Knowledge that precedes its time is never innocent. Parishioners were advised to avoid curiosity that might seem harmless, to ignore the whispers and the strange events that had been noticed by those few who had dared to read the diary. The priest's guidance was delivered calmly, without hysteria, yet carried a gravitas that few could ignore. The teacher, caught between disbelief and necessity, became increasingly isolated. Scholars would not take his findings seriously. The local church framed the diary as a spiritual threat, something to be avoided rather than studied. Even the small community that had initially offered whispered support began to fracture under the weight of fear and uncertainty. Those who had read the diary were subtly warned to maintain secrecy, to avoid drawing attention to what they had seen. In effect, the diary became simultaneously known and unknowable, a secret that everyone suspected but few were willing to acknowledge openly. Attempts to understand the diary scientifically were equally frustrating. The teacher contacted a parapsychologist in Boston, a man accustomed to studying the inexplicable. The researcher examined the diary with meticulous attention, ink composition, paper aging, and handwriting consistency. Every detail pointed to authenticity for the period claimed, yet the predictive content defied rational explanation. He reported back to the teacher, confiding that the diary had disrupted his sense of time, and that he could offer no definitive answers. Shortly afterward, the researcher withdrew entirely, citing a need to distance himself from the psychological strain the diary imposed. Even scientific inquiry seemed unable, or perhaps unwilling, to confront the diary fully. Meanwhile, the town's residents were left to navigate a quiet but growing unease. Ordinary routines persisted, but there was a pervasive sense that larger forces had entered their lives. Parents cautioned children not to linger near the teacher's home, not out of fear of physical danger, but from a vague apprehension of the diary's influence. Shopkeepers and neighbors, while polite, began to observe the teacher more closely, interpreting every gesture or remark through the lens of uncertainty. In these subtle ways, authority, both institutional and communal, asserted itself, not through action but through silence, suppression, and indirect guidance. The effect of this silence was profound. Where one might have expected open investigation, discussion, or even excitement, there was instead a collective reticence. Institutions of learning, spiritual leadership, and social structure all encouraged the townsfolk to ignore the diary, to avoid giving it significance, and to proceed as though it were no more than a curious artifact. Yet the suppression, rather than diminishing the diary's power, enhanced it. By framing inquiry as dangerous or inappropriate, authority lent the diary a mysterious gravitas. Its presence was no longer merely a matter of individual curiosity, it had become a societal tension, an unspoken question hovering over the town, quietly shaping behavior and perception. This quiet suppression also revealed the fragility of human curiosity when confronted with the impossible. Those who might have pursued scientific or historical investigation were deterred not by fear of ridicule alone, but by the subtle pressures of social and institutional expectation. To inquire too deeply was to risk marginalization, and to act publicly was to court misunderstanding. In effect, the diary's influence extended beyond the personal, it had become an external force that shaped the collective mind of the town. Ordinary mechanisms of accountability, verification, and reason were quietly subverted, leaving only uncertainty and unease in their place. Even those who persisted in private study faced mental and emotional strain. The teacher, now fully aware of the diary's scope, found himself questioning reality itself. Each verified prediction forced him to confront the limitations of rational explanation, and the persistent silence of those who might otherwise provide guidance made the challenge even more isolating. Friends and colleagues offered only polite skepticism, avoiding discussion, while authorities, whether religious, academic, or civic, signaled, without explicit words, that the matter was best left unexamined. This environment of constrained inquiry intensified the diary's psychological weight, embedding unease deep within those who engaged with it. By the end of this period, the diary had established a quiet dominance. It was not a tool of coercion, nor was it overtly violent or threatening. Its power came from the combination of undeniable predictive content and the systematic withdrawal of institutional support. Without opposition, debate, or verification from credible sources, the diary existed in a liminal space between known and unknown, forcing those who encountered it to navigate a world in which reality seemed mutable and authority had chosen, deliberately or unconsciously, to remain silent. In this way, the diary shaped the town not only through its contents but through absence of validation, absence of public recognition, and absence of clear guidance. The authorities' refusal to engage directly lent the diary an aura of inevitability, suggesting that some truths, though observable, were beyond the scope of human understanding. And in the quiet corridors of both homes and institutions, the diary began to exert its subtle influence, ensuring that curiosity, once awakened, could never be fully dismissed. By the time the teacher closed the diary each night, he understood that the silence of authority was not merely indifference. It was a force in itself, an invisible hand guiding the town's perception, shaping the narrative, and amplifying the diary's eerie resonance in ways that would echo through the coming decades. The true weight of the diary began to reveal itself when its entries moved from the abstract to the intimate. For years, townsfolk could rationalize its predictions as distant or impersonal, forecasts of disasters, political events, or regional occurrences that, while unsettling, remained removed from their daily lives. But then the diary began to focus inward, detailing events that would touch the lives of specific individuals, families, and even the smallest nuances of ordinary existence. Names of residents appeared with startling precision, accompanied by descriptions of moments that had not yet transpired. The boundaries between observer and observed collapsed, and the diary transformed from a mere curiosity into a mirror reflecting unavoidable truths. It started subtly. A passage mentioned a minor injury, a fall on a staircase, that would befall a local teenager, specifying the time of day and even the shoes he would be wearing. When the incident occurred exactly as described, the family, previously skeptical, was shaken. No ordinary prediction could have accounted for the specificity. Then came entries describing illnesses, sudden accidents, and personal tragedies with uncanny detail. The diary was no longer a catalogue of historical anomalies, it was a ledger of fate, a record of events yet to unfold in the lives of those still alive. For some, the predictions served as a warning, a chance to act differently, to perhaps alter the course of events. But the more they attempted intervention, the more complex the consequences became. One family tried to prevent a listed mishap, only to witness an alternate version of the incident manifest in an equally painful way. It became clear that the diary did not merely describe possibilities, it seemed to delineate inevitabilities. The notion of free will, comforting in ordinary life, became slippery and fragile in the face of its pages. The psychological impact was profound. Individuals who had previously gone about their daily routines began to act with heightened caution, or in some cases, paralysis. Parents forbade children from attending certain schools or crossing particular streets. Workers hesitated before undertaking normal tasks. Even casual conversation became strained, as the knowledge of potential futures crept into every interaction. Anxiety spread silently, infecting households and neighborhoods alike. The diary's entries, once read in isolation, now resonated outward, influencing choices and perceptions across the town. Some townsfolk, however, refused to acknowledge the predictions, insisting that the diary could not dictate reality. This denial created tension. Those who had seen events come true confronted those who had not, resulting in arguments, estrangements, and whispered resentments. Families were divided by belief and skepticism, friendships strained under the weight of expectation and fear. The diary, in its silent presence, had become a catalyst for social upheaval within a community that had once prided itself on cohesion and routine. As the diary's personal predictions became more precise, fear intensified. Residents began to notice an almost preternatural accuracy in its records, not just for themselves, but for neighbors and acquaintances. A woman reading an entry that described her cousin's impending accident could not prevent it, no matter how attentive or cautious she became. A man saw his own name listed alongside a predicted misfortune and found that attempts to divert the outcome only brought subtle variations, each as troubling as the last. The diary's influence became omnipresent, and its authority unquestionable in the minds of those who had witnessed even one accurate prophecy. The teacher, now fully aware of the diary's intimate reach, faced a growing moral dilemma. Could he share its contents with families, or would that knowledge only increase anxiety and despair? Each disclosure carried potential consequences, as if revealing the diary's predictions were itself a form of manipulation. The ethical weight of this knowledge pressed on him relentlessly. At times, he debated destroying the diary, reasoning that its disappearance might relieve townsfolk of its oppressive influence. Yet every attempt to part with it was met with hesitation, as if some invisible force insisted on preservation. The diary's authority was not just predictive, it was possessive. The town's social fabric began to warp subtly under the pressure of personal prophecies. Neighbors watched one another more closely, sometimes interpreting ordinary actions as signs of impending events. Conversations that once flowed freely were now laced with subtext and suspicion. Children learned to internalize fears they could not articulate, and adults moved cautiously through routines once considered trivial. Life itself became a series of measured steps, influenced by the quiet knowledge that the diary had the potential to make private events public, intimate experiences shared through ink and paper long before they were lived. The diary's predictions also introduced moral and ethical dilemmas. When the text described a potential tragedy, some individuals faced the agonizing question of whether intervention was a moral obligation. Could one act against fate, or would interference produce outcomes no less severe? Families struggled with these decisions, debating the proper course of action in hushed voices. Some chose to act, only to discover that the diary's entries were unalterable in ways both subtle and devastating. Others chose inaction, paralyzed by fear, watching helplessly as the foretold events came to pass. In either case, the diary reshaped decision-making at the most personal levels, embedding anxiety into the rhythm of daily life. By the early 1970s, the psychological impact had escalated. Individuals reported sleepless nights, persistent unease, and an almost obsessive compulsion to consult the diary repeatedly. Even those initially dismissive found themselves drawn to it, compelled by a mixture of curiosity and fear. The act of reading became ritualized, each entry examined, compared with memory, and cross-referenced against contemporaneous events. The diary's pull was undeniable, creating a pattern of behavior that resembled devotion, superstition, or obsession, depending on perspective. The diary had crossed a critical threshold. It was no longer simply predictive or mysterious. It had become personal, intimate, and invasive. Its reach extended into the private spheres of life, where human relationships, choices, and fears intertwined with the events it described. It created a shared, inescapable tension, the understanding that knowledge of the future, far from being liberating, carried with it a burden that few could endure without suffering. And so, in the quiet homes and dimly lit rooms of the town, prophecy transformed from abstract curiosity into personal ordeal. Names, events, and accidents recorded with chilling precision forced residents to confront the fragility of their daily lives, the limits of control, and the eerie weight of inevitabilities. The diary, silent and unassuming, had become a lodestone around which the town's collective anxiety gathered, and from which no individual could escape entirely. It was here, in these intimate revelations, that the diary's full power emerged. No longer distant or impersonal, it entered the most sacred and private spaces of human experience, reshaping perception, dictating caution, and instilling a persistent, quiet dread that would follow the townsfolk for decades to come. As the diary's predictions became increasingly precise and personal, curiosity demanded an explanation. Scholars, scientists, and town residents alike struggled to reconcile the impossible with the world they believed they understood. Initial theories ranged from the plausible to the fantastical, each attempting to impose order on what seemed chaotic yet meticulously detailed. People sought patterns, causal relationships, and hidden mechanisms, determined to make sense of a phenomenon that defied conventional understanding. The first approach was historical verification. Experts examined the diary for inconsistencies, anachronisms, or forgery. Every detail, ink composition, paper aging, handwriting style, was scrutinized meticulously. Researchers consulted archives, checked local and national records, and even compared predictions with unrelated documents from the same period. Curiously, every verifiable event described in the diary was accurate, aligning precisely with subsequent occurrences. The materials themselves appeared authentic, originating from the era claimed by the diary. This eliminated the possibility of simple deception, a revelation that only deepened the mystery. Next came statistical analysis. Mathematicians and psychologists attempted to calculate the probability of the diary's predictions aligning with real events by chance. They catalogued every entry, from minor accidents to major catastrophes, measuring accuracy against random expectations. Even the most conservative estimates yielded probabilities so low as to be virtually impossible. Some researchers speculated that the diary functioned as an extraordinary coincidence generator, yet none could provide a mechanism explaining how chance alone could produce such sustained and precise foresight. Parapsychologists were consulted, exploring theories of precognition, telepathy, and other phenomena often dismissed by mainstream science. In controlled environments, they attempted to replicate predictive behaviors, using volunteers, simulations, and experimental protocols. Yet no human or technological method could reliably reproduce the results described in the diary. The entries suggested not just isolated instances of foresight, but an ongoing, sustained observation of events far into the future, as if someone, or something, had access to time itself. These attempts, while inconclusive, hinted at possibilities beyond conventional understanding, inviting both fascination and fear. Theological interpretations emerged simultaneously. Religious authorities and thinkers speculated that the diary might be divinely inspired, a conduit of knowledge beyond human comprehension. Some viewed it as a moral test, designed to challenge faith and humility, while others warned that meddling with such a record could invite spiritual peril. Sermons and writings suggested that the diary's author, known or unknown, had been granted insight for reasons that might never be fully explained. Faith, however, provided comfort to some, but little clarity. Belief offered a framework for understanding, yet it could not answer practical questions or account for the exactitude of the diary's predictions. Local authorities, wary of public reaction, adopted a policy of measured silence. Town officials issued no statements, neither validating nor condemning the diary. Police and civic leaders declined to investigate predictions, fearing panic or social unrest. Their inaction, intentional or otherwise, left residents to navigate the diary's revelations alone. In this vacuum, speculation flourished. Rumors mingled with careful observation, and small groups of citizens took it upon themselves to test, verify, and monitor the diary's claims, forming informal networks of inquiry that existed largely in secrecy. Attempts to trace the diary's origin yielded few clues. Its provenance was partially documented, appearing in estate records of a recently deceased local resident. Yet the pages detailing events decades into the future raised questions impossible to answer. Some hypothesized that the author possessed an unknown method of recording information, a combination of genius, intuition, and meticulous observation. Others suggested a supernatural explanation, that the diary served as a bridge between time periods, or that it was guided by forces beyond human comprehension. No evidence conclusively supported any single theory. One prominent line of inquiry involved cross-referencing predictions with scientific trends. Experts in technology, meteorology, and social sciences attempted to project forward from existing knowledge, reasoning that the diary's predictions might be extrapolations rather than true foresight. Yet these projections often fell short. Some events described were highly specific, detailing moments and occurrences that could not have been predicted from contemporary knowledge or statistical modeling. The diary's precision exceeded what even the most sophisticated predictive methods of the 1960s could achieve. Psychological analysis revealed the profound impact the diary had on human behavior. Researchers noted that reading it often led to heightened awareness, anxiety, and obsession. Individuals who engaged with the text frequently reported anticipatory stress, sleeplessness, and hypervigilance. In some cases, people began unconsciously aligning their behaviors with the diary's entries, as if the act of reading its predictions subtly guided actions, even without deliberate intent. Here, the diary functioned as both a source of knowledge and a catalyst for altered perception, shaping reality through human psychology as well as prophecy. Despite these varied investigations, no consensus emerged. Each attempt to explain the diary revealed as much uncertainty as clarity. Historical authenticity, statistical probability, psychic phenomena, religious interpretation, and psychological influence all offered partial insights, yet none could account fully for the diary's breadth, specificity, and sustained accuracy. Its origins, mechanisms, and purpose remained elusive, a riddle whose complexity deepened with each study. This growing uncertainty had tangible consequences for the town. Curiosity and fear intertwined, shaping social interactions, decision-making, and community dynamics. Families debated whether to act on the diary's predictions or ignore them entirely. Individuals wrestled with ethical questions, wondering if knowledge of future events imposed a responsibility to intervene, even when doing so might yield unpredictable outcomes. The diary became both a guide and a burden, shaping behavior in subtle, pervasive ways. By the mid-1970s, the diary had established a status almost mythic in its scope. Those who had attempted explanations, whether scientific, historical, religious, or psychological, found themselves frustrated, haunted, or transformed by their investigations. Skeptics were forced to confront phenomena they could not reconcile with reason alone. Believers gained validation, yet continued to struggle with fear and moral dilemmas. And the diary, silent yet insistent, continued to unfold, page by page, prediction by prediction, leaving those who engaged with it suspended between comprehension and awe. In essence, the diary's attempts at explanation became part of its legend. Each failure, each partial insight, reinforced the notion that the book was beyond ordinary understanding. Its authority was not rooted solely in accuracy, but in the persistent inability of human inquiry to fully account for it. Scholars, clergy, and citizens alike found themselves enmeshed in a phenomenon that challenged every assumption about time, knowledge, and human capability. And so, the diary remained, simultaneously open and impenetrable, a testament to the limits of explanation and the enduring power of mystery. Those who had sought answers discovered only the depth of their own curiosity and the profound realization that some truths, no matter how diligently pursued, might never be fully known. The town, once orderly and predictable in its rhythms, began to show signs of strain as the diary's influence deepened. Small fractures that had been nearly imperceptible widened under the weight of anticipation, anxiety, and uncertainty. Families withdrew from neighbors, community gatherings grew quieter, and social routines once taken for granted were disrupted by an unspoken awareness that events might be unfolding precisely as the diary had predicted. Ordinary spaces, homes, shops, schools, carried a latent tension, a quiet anxiety that lingered in the air, unspoken but palpable. For the teacher, the process of isolation was gradual but inexorable. Nights spent reading the diary extended into weeks and months, his social interactions diminishing as the weight of foreknowledge pressed upon him. Friends and colleagues, initially curious or supportive, began to distance themselves, wary of becoming entangled in a phenomenon they neither understood nor wished to confront. He found that he could no longer speak casually of daily events without filtering every statement through the lens of prediction. Conversations became exercises in self-censorship, not for politeness, but for fear of inadvertently aligning with, or contradicting, the diary's entries. Families who had once shared communal life now fractured under the strain of expectation. Parents monitored children with hypervigilance, guided by the diary's intimations of future harm or misfortune. Siblings, once playful companions, began to regard one another cautiously, questioning actions, motives, and the potential consequences of each movement. Even neighbors, who had previously engaged in routine interactions like exchanging greetings or borrowing tools, now approached cautiously, aware that casual behavior might align with predictions or inadvertently trigger outcomes described in the diary. The town's social cohesion began to crumble, replaced by a pervasive quiet anxiety. Isolation was both social and psychological. Individuals who engaged deeply with the diary reported sleepless nights, an unrelenting mental focus on the details of its entries, and the creeping sense that reality itself had become malleable. Ordinary activities, shopping, walking through town, attending church, were imbued with tension. People found themselves scanning their surroundings for signs that events were unfolding as predicted, often interpreting innocent occurrences as confirmations or warnings. The diary had transformed perception itself, creating a heightened sensitivity that could not easily be reconciled with normal life. Communal institutions, too, responded in subtle ways. Schools adjusted schedules to accommodate minor predictions, while civic leaders avoided public discussion of the diary entirely. Businesses that relied on trust and routine began to experience tension among employees and customers. Even religious gatherings were touched by unspoken caution, sermons carrying coded warnings about curiosity and the dangers of presumption. Authority, once a stabilizing force, had withdrawn, leaving residents to navigate uncertainty on their own. This withdrawal was interpreted variously as prudent discretion, implicit acknowledgement of danger, or a sign that the diary had surpassed human control. The diary's influence also manifested in emotional and psychological strain. Families and individuals reported pervasive anxiety, irritability, and a constant preoccupation with the content of its entries. Sleep became fragmented, dreams were filled with vivid and often disturbing scenarios from the diary, and daytime activities were colored by anticipatory fear. Those who had previously been skeptical found themselves drawn inexorably into a web of attention, observation, and interpretation. Even casual readers discovered that the act of consulting the diary was addictive, a compulsive need to verify events and monitor outcomes, feeding an escalating cycle of psychological tension. Attempts to maintain normalcy were increasingly futile. Ordinary routines, shopping, attending school, performing work, were constantly reframed through the lens of prediction. Residents became hyper-aware of patterns, coincidences, and subtle shifts in behavior, interpreting them as potential confirmations of the diary's foresight. Social gatherings, once predictable in rhythm and tone, were now suffused with quiet suspicion. Friendships were strained, neighbors regarded each other with caution, and even simple gestures, such as knocking on a door or offering a greeting, carried potential significance. The town's life was no longer spontaneous, it had become a choreography shaped by foreknowledge, anticipation, and fear. For the teacher, the collapse was internal as well as external. Hours spent cross-referencing entries, verifying details, and observing outcomes left him physically and emotionally exhausted. He became increasingly isolated, rarely leaving his home except to conduct necessary errands or to observe the town from a distance. His mind remained tethered to the diary, oscillating between curiosity and dread. The act of reading became ritualized, a nightly obsession that offered both clarity and torment. Sleep, when it came, was filled with dreams of events yet to unfold, or of interactions he could not control, reinforcing the sense that reality itself was slipping beyond his grasp. Isolation extended to the broader town community. Small support networks, once informal and resilient, began to unravel under stress. Families retreated to private spaces, limiting interaction with neighbors. Shared celebrations, festivals, and communal gatherings were curtailed, replaced with quiet, cautious routines. Children were monitored closely, adults moved through their days with deliberate care, and every minor action was analyzed for alignment with or deviation from predictions. The diary, silent on the table or in a drawer, had transformed the town's social fabric through its very presence, creating a community simultaneously aware and immobilized. Psychologically, the diary's influence was compounding. Residents reported a creeping sense of inevitability, as though every action, no matter how small, contributed to the unfolding of events beyond their control. Anxiety became chronic, manifesting in irritability, hypervigilance, and, in some cases, depressive withdrawal. Social bonds weakened as fear became the lens through which every interaction was filtered. The diary had not merely predicted future events, it had imposed a psychological architecture on the town, shaping behavior, perception, and decision-making through its silent authority. In some households, isolation turned to obsession. Individuals spent hours with the diary, cross-referencing entries, noting coincidences, and attempting to anticipate the next prediction. These readers, once casual or skeptical, now devoted themselves to near-constant vigilance. Families were affected indirectly, as the emotional and cognitive strain of diary observation spread through the household. In this way, the book exerted influence not only over direct readers but over the broader community, infiltrating private lives and quietly restructuring the norms of daily existence. By the late 1970s, the cumulative effects of isolation and social collapse were unmistakable. The town, once lively and communal, had become a quiet, tense place. Streets were traversed with caution, public spaces were entered warily, and conversation was muted, filtered through anticipation and concern. The diary, silent in its pages, had orchestrated this transformation not through force or coercion, but through knowledge, influence, and the subtle reshaping of human perception. Its power lay not in violence or spectacle, but in its capacity to bend attention, alter behavior, and create an atmosphere of inescapable foreknowledge. And so, collapse and isolation became the town's reality. Ordinary routines were now extraordinary exercises in caution. Social bonds were strained under the weight of predictive knowledge. Families and individuals navigated a world simultaneously familiar and alien, forever influenced by the silent, immutable presence of the diary. Its influence was invisible yet undeniable, an unspoken architecture shaping the lives, choices, and anxieties of those who had dared to look within its pages. When the initial shock of the diary's revelation settled, the town entered a period marked by quiet reflection and restrained observation. The immediate urgency of its predictions had passed, yet the impact remained, lingering in households, public spaces, and the consciousness of every individual who had encountered its pages. Life resumed in a superficial sense, shops opened, children returned to schools, and streets once again bore the rhythm of daily routine, but beneath this facade of normalcy, a profound tension persisted. The diary's influence had not dissipated, it had merely entered a subtler, more enduring phase. Families bore the weight of memory. Parents who had witnessed the diary's accuracy, or suffered the consequences of events foretold, carried the experience as both a cautionary tale and a source of silent dread. Conversations within households often returned to the diary in indirect ways, a reference to a past incident, a hesitation in making decisions, a deliberate choice to avoid curiosity. Even when the book itself was hidden from view, its presence remained palpable, a ghostly reminder of knowledge both irresistible and dangerous. Children, too, absorbed this atmosphere. They learned that some questions were better left unasked, that curiosity could invite anxiety, and that the world contained elements beyond immediate understanding. Among townsfolk, silence became a defining feature. The diary had instilled a shared restraint, a collective understanding that open discussion might bring scrutiny or invite forces beyond comprehension. Social interactions were careful, measured, and deliberate. People who had once engaged freely in conversation now spoke with subtle caution, avoiding topics that could be construed as speculative or threatening. Public spaces carried a quiet awareness, an unspoken acknowledgement of events that had occurred and of those that might still unfold. The town had adopted a code of conduct shaped less by law or authority than by the invisible influence of the diary itself. Despite the overarching quiet, memories of past incidents persisted. Residents remembered small coincidences that had confirmed predictions, subtle alignments of events that could not be explained by chance alone. These recollections were shared cautiously, often in private or whispered tones, and served as both validation and warning. Each retelling reinforced the town's collective awareness that the diary's reach extended beyond its physical form. Even when unread for months or years, its legacy shaped perception, influencing behavior, decision-making, and the interpretation of everyday occurrences. Attempts to resume normal inquiry or investigation were met with internal and external resistance. Scholars who had initially sought to study the diary expressed frustration at the enduring mystery, while families often discouraged discussion to protect younger generations from anxiety or obsession. Individuals who had read extensively were now wary of revisiting predictions, concerned that renewed attention might rekindle the stress and tension they had endured. In this way, the diary had achieved a form of control through absence. By receding from active observation, it compelled a continued awareness and psychological engagement among those who remembered its power. The town itself bore physical and social markers of the diary's influence. Certain neighborhoods had become quieter than others, public gatherings were smaller and more restrained, and even recreational activities were approached with caution. Community institutions, schools, churches, local government, maintained operations but subtly altered their practices. Schedules, routines, and communal events were adapted to accommodate caution, even when the diary's direct influence was no longer actively invoked. Its effects had embedded themselves in the structural rhythms of the town, shaping daily life in ways imperceptible yet persistent. Psychological consequences were notable. Residents reported a lingering sense of unease, a heightened awareness of coincidence, and a cautious approach to decision-making. Many acknowledged an enduring fascination with the diary's content, balanced by a fear of re-engagement. Sleep patterns, once disrupted during periods of active observation, slowly normalized, yet dreams occasionally revisited past predictions. These subconscious echoes reinforced the diary's long-term imprint on memory and perception, creating a sense of shared history tinged with apprehension. The teacher, who had maintained the closest relationship with the diary, became a figure of both reverence and isolation. Neighbors treated him with a quiet respect, often seeking guidance indirectly while avoiding explicit discussion. His home, once a hub of inquiry and attention, settled into relative solitude. Yet even in isolation, he continued to reflect upon the diary's entries, comparing memory to outcome and noting patterns that others could no longer observe. His role shifted from active participant to custodian of a legacy, carrying the burden of knowledge and the responsibility of discretion. Local silence was not merely avoidance, it was protective. Families, neighbors, and community leaders intuitively recognized that open discussion could rekindle fear, obsession, or social discord. In this way, the town collectively enforced a code of restraint, ensuring that the diary's influence persisted without erupting into public panic. Knowledge became both a shield and a constraint, guiding behavior, communication, and interpersonal boundaries. This social contract, unspoken yet universally understood, allowed daily life to continue while acknowledging the extraordinary events that had transpired. Legends and memory intertwined. Even as decades passed, stories of the diary persisted, passed down carefully from generation to generation. Recollections were often fragmented, emphasizing select predictions, moments of uncanny accuracy, and the subtle psychological effects observed among residents. Yet these retellings were always measured, avoiding sensationalism or dramatization. The diary's legacy became a tapestry of memory, reflection, and caution, a silent presence shaping identity, behavior, and social norms across time. By the end of this period, the diary had achieved an equilibrium within the town. Its presence, though no longer actively consulted by most residents, remained embedded in consciousness, behavior, and social structure. The town had adapted, adopting practices of caution, observation, and discretion that allowed daily life to proceed without directly confronting the diary's full implications. In effect, silence became the town's answer, a quiet strategy that preserved continuity while honoring the unexplainable. The aftermath of the diary's influence was thus defined not by dramatic events or overt crisis, but by subtle transformations in perception, behavior, and communal dynamics. Residents had internalized lessons of caution and awareness, creating a society that functioned within the invisible parameters of a text that could predict the future. Authority, memory, and observation all contributed to maintaining this equilibrium, allowing the town to exist in a state of fragile normalcy under the shadow of extraordinary knowledge. In the end, local silence became both legacy and safeguard. It ensured that curiosity, fear, and awareness persisted without overwhelming daily life. It reinforced social bonds subtly, guiding behavior through shared restraint. And it preserved the diary's mystique, allowing it to remain a silent arbiter of perception, an enduring presence that shaped the town's consciousness and culture long after the immediacy of its predictions had passed. As the diary faded into the quieter chapters of the town's collective memory, scholars, residents, and casual observers alike wrestled with its implications. Its predictions, precise and personal, had left indelible marks on individuals and communities. Yet despite decades of examination, discussion, and speculation, no single explanation could fully account for its origin, mechanism, or purpose. The diary became, in essence, a prism through which reality was refracted, revealing both clarity and ambiguity, certainty and doubt. Historical analysis remained inconclusive. Experts confirmed the diary's authenticity, but the predictive content continued to defy rational understanding. Its originator, whether a local resident, an unknown author, or a figure lost to history, remained unidentified. Some historians speculated that it was the product of extraordinary genius, a meticulous observer capable of anticipating social, technological, and personal developments far ahead of his time. Others suggested a more extraordinary hypothesis, that the author possessed insight into future events beyond the constraints of linear time, or that the diary itself was influenced by forces beyond human comprehension. Yet all attempts at definitive historical explanation faltered, leaving only conjecture. Scientific inquiry, too, reached its limits. Attempts to replicate the diary's predictive accuracy failed consistently. Statistical analyses, probabilistic modeling, and controlled experiments could not account for the sheer specificity and sustained accuracy of its entries. Even parapsychological approaches, often dismissed as fringe, yielded only partial or inconclusive results. It became evident that the diary's phenomenon could not be fully understood through conventional empirical methods. The boundaries of reason were tested, revealing both the power and limitation of human understanding in the face of something anomalous yet undeniably real. Psychological interpretations offered partial insight. The diary's influence on behavior, perception, and social dynamics was unmistakable. Readers experienced heightened anxiety, obsessive scrutiny, and altered decision-making patterns. Its presence, even when not actively consulted, shaped interactions, choices, and emotional states. In this sense, the diary functioned as a catalyst for human cognition, revealing the interplay between knowledge, expectation, and perception. Yet psychology alone could not explain the diary's predictive accuracy, it could only account for the human response to it. Theological perspectives remained varied and unresolved. Some religious authorities posited that the diary was divinely inspired, a vessel of moral or spiritual instruction. Others suggested it was a test, designed to challenge faith, humility, and discernment. Still others warned of potential spiritual peril, cautioning against curiosity or engagement with forces beyond human understanding. Faith provided comfort to some, yet offered no definitive explanation for the diary's detailed foreknowledge. Religious interpretations existed alongside scientific and historical inquiry, creating a complex, multilayered discourse that remained unresolved. Philosophical inquiry emerged as another framework for understanding. Scholars debated the implications of foreknowledge on free will, morality, and human agency. If the diary described events with unerring precision, to what extent could individuals alter their destinies? Were human actions predetermined, or did awareness of the diary's predictions create an illusion of inevitability? These questions challenged foundational assumptions about causality, ethics, and temporal perception. Residents, scholars, and casual observers alike found themselves confronting dilemmas that were abstract in theory but profoundly real in daily life. Local reflection offered additional complexity. Townsfolk, many of whom had lived through the diary's influence, retained memories and anecdotal accounts that defied categorization. Some described small, seemingly coincidental alignments between diary entries and subsequent events, while others recounted psychological effects that lingered for decades. Oral histories and private journals revealed a shared awareness that the diary had been both guide and burden, shaping daily life, behavior, and community dynamics in subtle yet profound ways. These collective experiences, though fragmented, provided an emotional and social dimension to understanding the diary's impact. The question of causality remained central to unresolved inquiry. Was the diary a passive record of inevitable events, or did its very existence influence the unfolding of those events? Were outcomes described within its pages fixed, or could human intervention alter them? Cases in which intervention seemed to modify outcomes only partially or in unexpected ways fueled debate. The diary's interplay with human action suggested a complex, dynamic relationship between prediction, perception, and reality, one that defied simple classification and resisted reduction to conventional explanation. Some theorists proposed that the diary functioned as a psychological mirror, amplifying attention, expectation, and awareness to the point where coincidences appeared inevitable. Others suggested it was a temporal artifact, capturing slices of future events as though time were not linear but layered, accessible in part through extraordinary observation or unknown methods. These divergent hypotheses reflected the limitations of human understanding when confronted with phenomena that exceeded conventional frameworks. No single theory could reconcile the diary's predictive precision with its profound psychological and social influence. As decades passed, the diary's legacy remained unresolved, a source of fascination and contemplation. Scholars continued to publish articles, townsfolk maintained cautious curiosity, and occasional researchers revisited the diary's contents. Each approach illuminated aspects of its influence while leaving other dimensions obscure. Its full implications, ethical, philosophical, scientific, and psychological, remained tantalizingly out of reach. In this way, the diary's unresolved questions became part of its enduring narrative, a testament to the persistence of mystery and the limitations of understanding. Ultimately, the diary's power lay not only in its predictions but in its ability to provoke reflection across multiple domains. It challenged assumptions about time, reality, knowledge, and human agency. It shaped behavior, influenced social dynamics, and altered perception. It left a community forever changed, instilling caution, curiosity, and a shared recognition of forces beyond comprehension. The diary's authority persisted precisely because it remained enigmatic, resisting closure, defying explanation, and demanding engagement with uncertainty. And so, even as the town settled into quiet routines and the years advanced, the diary's presence, physical, psychological, and cultural, remained an unresolved question. It inspired scholarship, reflection, and debate while subtly guiding human behavior. It served as a mirror, a cautionary tale, and a locus of wonder, demonstrating that some mysteries are enduring not because they are unsolvable, but because their complexity exceeds the ordinary capacity for comprehension. The diary's story, unfinished yet persistent, became a meditation on knowledge, uncertainty, and the human desire to confront the unknown. In this final analysis, the diary exists not merely as a historical artifact, but as a living enigma. Its predictions, its influence on human thought and action, and its unexplainable accuracy collectively pose questions that may never be fully answered. It challenges assumptions about reality, time, and human capability, leaving those who engage with it in a state of awe, contemplation, and cautious reverence. Its unresolved nature ensures that it continues to captivate, perplex, and inspire inquiry, a testament to the enduring power of the unknown in human life. The diary's unresolved questions, then, are not a sign of failure in understanding, but a reflection of the limits of human cognition, perception, and authority. In resisting complete explanation, it asserts its presence across time, memory, and imagination, leaving a legacy both chilling and compelling. Scholars, residents, and future generations are left to ponder its meaning, significance, and origin, an enduring challenge, a mystery whose conclusion may never arrive, and a testament to the enduring tension between knowledge and uncertainty.